Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Mariam Khan, Research Associate at Center for Islam and Global Affairs. I welcome you all on the behalf of CIGA at Sabahat Nizam University on our Ramadan webinar series. Today is 4th of May 2020, 11th of Ramadan, and our 11th session of Ramadan webinar series. Today our guest speaker is Dr. Abdullah Al-Aryan, who is an Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University, Qatar, where he specializes in the modern Middle East and the study of social movements. Dr. Al-Aryan is author of Answering the Call Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat, Egypt, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. And he's also co-editor of Critical Currents in Islam page of the Jadaliya zine. Dr. Aryan is currently writing a book on Islamism and nationalism in Arab world and also writing a project on football in the Middle East. Today, Dr. Al-Aryan will enlighten us on Beyond the Soft Power, Football as a Form of Regime Legitimation. Dr. Al-Aryan, floor is yours. You'll be speaking for 50 minutes, and after that, we'll be entertaining some of the questions. Here you go.
Hi, and greetings to everyone joining us wherever you are. Whatever time it is, good morning here. I'm in Washington at the moment. And thank you so much to everyone at CIGA for organizing this and for hosting me and inviting me to present on this new research project that I've been working on. I'll just give a few kind of words of introduction. This project is part of a much bigger research project that's being hosted at the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown's campus in Qatar. And the project is on football in politics in the Middle East, looking at questions of kind of identity, of just the way that kind of political regimes have been kind of looking to use football for their own purposes. That's been sort of my project. And so the title of this paper is Beyond Soft Power, Football as a Form of Regime Legitimation. And I'll start with a little bit of historical background, just to kind of give you a sense of how this practice actually goes back much further. Although most of the case studies and examples that I'll be talking about here today are more contemporary and more recent, this really is a practice that I would argue is kind of as old as the sport itself. And so I think this is sort of where many of us find our starting points in doing research on the uses of sports in all kinds of cultural forms for political purposes by regimes. We tend to believe that the sports in and of themselves maintain a certain kind of inherent political quality, that it's so not just something that's sort of value free or neutral that then becomes employed, but that they themselves as institutions, as cultural institutions and practices, maintain certain kinds of political features to themselves. And so going back to the 1950s, and this is in 1957 when Egypt was one of the 4 countries in Africa to spearhead the establishment of the Confederation of African Football. This was the latest continental confederation that was recognized by FIFA, of course, the global football governing body. And within days, the first African Cup of Nations kicked off. It was held in Sudan. 3 teams participated, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Because the 4th country that helped start the CAF was actually South Africa, which was disqualified when it stipulated that it would be fielding an all-white team. So Egypt went on to win that first cup. It defeated Sudan 2-1 in the semifinal. It then went on to beat Ethiopia 4-0 in the final, and it lifted that first inaugural cup in front of 20,000 fans in Khartoum in Sudan, where the tournament was held. And so I think when we think back to this era, the 1950s, we see that for a lot of countries, and especially for Egypt and Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, that they were enthusiastic about the rise of African football because they saw it as an act of decolonization. Nasser was very particular about planning the meetings that led to the establishment of the Confederation of African Football, and he even insisted that the first tournament should be held as soon as it gained approval from FIFA. And so this was only a few days after the organization was approved. And this, of course, comes at a time when Egypt finally rids itself of the last British forces that were stationed in Egypt in the mid-1950s. And it wanted to affirm itself as part of this kind of growing community of nations by joining international bodies, but not just groups like the United Nations, which it did, of course, in 1945, but also through membership in sporting organizations like FIFA. And Egypt, of course, was the first African nation to be able to do so as early as the 1930s. But also domestically, Gamal Abdel Nasser understood the power of football to mobilize people in Egypt. Al Ahli Football Club, of course, a historic club in Cairo, had very deep anti-colonial roots. In 1956, the club itself chose Nasser to become its honorary president. Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir, who commanded Egypt's armed forces, was then also entrusted to take over the Egyptian Football Association and oversee its growth, and viewed it really as a predominant force in popular culture that had the ability to shift its aims or integrate its aims with the aims of the state. Amir, for example, granted many of football's rising stars with military honors. And then, of course, we have these kind of massive construction projects, the most important and impressive of which was the construction of Nasser Stadium, later renamed Cairo International Stadium, which was a very impressive feat of state modernization. It could boast over 120,000 people standing room capacity, and also to use the occasion of the 8th anniversary of the July 1952 military coup. So 1960, he inaugurated the stadium for the first time and proclaims that the stadium's construction was a symbol that Egypt had become, quote, free to develop our country as we see fit. And then on the international stage, Nasser maintained that football had the power to withstand the efforts to marginalize and isolate states. And so when we think about the fact that CAF was established in 1957, this was very shortly after the tripartite attack on Egypt by British, French, and Israeli forces. Of course, that followed the 1956 nationalization of the Suez Canal by Abdel Nasser. And so these attempts to establish solidarity links with other African nations was part of its attempt to end any sort of attempted isolation, and was part of Nasser's post-revolutionary foreign policy outlook, in which Africa played a very pivotal role as well. And we see that through CAF, there's also attempts, on the one hand, to establish stronger relations with states, especially countries like Sudan and Ethiopia, who shared major security concerns with Egypt in terms of access to the Nile waters and so forth. But it also served as a mechanism to stand in opposition to the racist practices of apartheid South Africa, which of course was part of the founding members of CAF, but then was suspended almost immediately until it was allowed to be readmitted following the fall of apartheid more than 3 decades later. So all of this is simply just to show us examples of the fact that in all of these instances we have situations in which the establishment of African football and Egyptian football in particular were sort of made to fit particular goals of the regime in question at the time. And we'll see that all of these fit certain kinds of examples that I'll talk about later. And so, of course, more recently, there's been tremendous interest in trying to kind of understand the role that football plays in international politics and also in domestic politics. But I think one of the arguments that I'll be making is that, on the one hand, we see that this is a practice that tends to be consigned to the realm of soft power. Now, soft power is this international relations theory that was developed by the theorist Joseph Nye that basically looks specifically after the Cold War that U.S. power projection really should be seen as a form of soft power. The way he defines it is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than through coercion or payments, and that it arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideals, and policies. And I think there's a little problem here in the way that we think of culture and politics, that culture somehow is just only consigned to the category of soft power, and thinking about cultural institutions and practices as simply means to attract other states and attract other populations. So we even have in another case, another scholar and former diplomat who suggests that sports as a form of soft power have the ability to bring people together in terms of political adversaries, raise the national profile, sell the national brand, and possibly even bring world peace. And so I think cultural exchange, while it's important to think about it in those terms, we also have to kind of think about it more broadly, beyond simply those uses of soft power. And so when we observe, for instance, the Middle East region in particular, which of course is the focus of my research, that the soft power explanation has become so fashionable as to in some ways try to explain everything and ultimately ends up explaining kind of nothing. The reason it becomes so fashionable, I think, really delves into the ways that Gulf states in particular have played a specific kind of role in the world of global football. When we think about, obviously, headlining the list of these recent achievements was the decision by FIFA in 2010 to award its landmark event, the World Cup, to Qatar. And so along with the 2022 World Cup, Gulf states, including Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, have also served host to a number of international tournaments, regional tournaments, like the Asian Football Confederation's Asian Cup, like the FIFA Club World Cup, and then, of course, in 2018-19, Saudi Arabia even hosted the domestic cups for both Italy and Spain. And so transforming the Gulf region into a global football hub has also been coupled with other efforts by Gulf states to expand their reach into European elite leagues. And so this includes everything from lucrative kit sponsorship deals to just outright ownership of some of the world's currently most high-profile clubs. And so in these ways, Gulf states have also tried to become game-changing players in European football as well. And so when we examine the causes and consequences of these and other developments, most of the analyses have focused almost exclusively on this question of soft power. And so we think about things like when the French club PSG had an aggressive transfer policy a few years ago, which I'll talk about momentarily, and this in the press was described as a high-profile soft power play. When Emirates Airlines kit sponsorship deals with several European clubs also reflected a soft power strategy to market the UAE as a, quote, global example of prestige and excellence. And Abu Dhabi's ownership of Manchester City's football club has served as, quote, an incredibly powerful tool to mold an image on an international stage. Even Qatar's $200 billion investment to host the 2022 FIFA World Cup has just been explained as an effort to raise, quote, brand awareness of the country. So I'm not dismissing these kinds of arguments. I think there's certainly some case to be made that deploying football in the service of national branding, regional and global integration, positive image cultivation, that all of those things are certainly valid up to a point, but that this chapter or this paper really proposes to go beyond soft power explanations to try to explore the other ways in which football serves the political interests of states. And specifically what I argue is that states have found particular uses of football as a tool for acquiring legitimacy in the face of internal and external threats. And so just to kind of go a little bit into some definition, in this case, we're looking at legitimacy in non-democratic context as understood as, quote, something that autocracies attempt to acquire or cultivate through legitimation claims, symbols, narratives, and or procedures. And so within that, I think it's very clear that various forms of cultural expression, particularly those around which populations have actually demonstrated an ability to rally and unite, can actually serve as powerful tools for regimes. I'll spare you a little bit more of the kind of the theoretical sections of the paper. Certainly that's something I'm happy to get to if there are questions about it later on. And so what I want to do maybe is outline a little bit of sort of what are the different categories that and different forms that this process can take. So what are the different ways that states can actually employ the use of football for legitimation purposes? And I've kind of divided these roughly into about 5 different categories. And I'll give some examples for each one, but I'll just kind of quickly list off what those categories are. So the first example that I give is states using football as a mode of legitimizing neo-imperial control. And I look at this specifically in the aftermath of the 2003 US invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that happened. Also, we see that states can channel popular sentiments toward the national football team as an extension of authoritarian control during periods of political transition. And so I see this in Egypt, and I'll give actually 2 examples from Egypt. One comes to us from the late Mubarak era, and then also from more recent times in terms of following the military coup that brought Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to power in Egypt in 2013. States can also turn to their investments in football to ward off specific threats during times of crisis. And here I look specifically at Qatar's actions in the summer of 2017, just after the launch of the blockade against it by the quartet of states led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And then in the fourth category, we look at the UAE itself. During the exact same period, we've seen that states can also leverage their economic power and the high stakes of European football to extract political concessions in pursuit of their strategic goals. And then finally, the last category that I have is one in which states can also use their promotion of football to counteract international isolation and negative publicity resulting from damaging policies in other arenas. And I think here we can look specifically at what Saudi Arabia has done and actively attempted to do at the same time that it's waged, of course, this destructive war in Yemen and carried out its campaign to repress dissent both at home and abroad. And I should note here first that none of these categories are mutually exclusive, and that states can actually employ more than one at any given time. And so even when I talk about sports washing in Saudi Arabia, this is also a feature of a number of other states that are still pursuing legitimacy by other means. And even a lot of analyses that have tended to invoke the soft power framework have also acknowledged, and so we've seen examples of writers, reporters, journalists, as well as academics, scholars, commentators, people who've sort of been following a lot of these stories. They'll still invoke the soft power language and they'll still use it as a model, but they'll acknowledge that it's certainly behaving in ways that extends beyond soft power to look at things like sports washing and look at other kinds of means by which sports ultimately get used. And so I'll start with the first category that I'm looking at here, and this is football as a form of neo-imperial control. And so this one takes us back to the summer of 2004 at the Olympic Games that were held in Athens, in which the Iraqi national football team took the competition by storm. They defeated Portugal 4-2 in their opening match before beating Costa Rica 2-0 to go into the quarterfinal stage, having won their group. The Iraqis continued their unexpected run, getting a narrow 1-0 victory over Australia, which basically put them in the semifinal in a matchup against Paraguay, and this actually put them in a position to compete for an Olympic medal. And so the Iraqi team's impressive run was all the more compelling when we consider the country's recent history of repression and violence at the hands of both local and foreign actors. And so if we think about the fact that at this stage in 2004, most of the players who were probably 23 or under had grown up in a state that was ruled by an authoritarian dictatorship under the rule of Saddam Hussein. The nation had been racked by a destructive war against Iran in the 1980s, a military confrontation with the US coalition in 1991, followed by a devastating decade of UN sanctions that cost the lives of over 500,000 Iraqi children. And then, of course, to top it off, in 2003, George W. Bush launched a military invasion and occupation of Iraq under the guise of combating global terrorism and promoting democracy in the Middle East. And so this was really barely a year since this occupation of the country had began that Iraqis had found themselves competing in the Olympics, while at home they struggled with the absence of basic government services, the exploitation of their resources, the exacerbation of political divisions that had spilled over into militant violence, often due to this process of sectarianization that was inflamed by local elites as well as, of course, the occupying power. So it's against this background that I think it's important to look at what happens next, which is that the performance of the Iraqi team in that case offered a narrative of perseverance in the face of adversity and national unity at a time of deep social and political division. And this was the narrative that was very deeply exploited by the Bush administration when the war itself was becoming more and more unpopular among Americans and threatening Bush's prospects for re-election. So when we think about 2004, this was an election year in the United States, a time when Bush's famous mission accomplished speech a year earlier had been sort of mocked. There was a sense that over a year later, this transition to democracy had yet to take effect. And the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, that was sort of leading the government in Iraq under the sort of occupation, had yet to really hand the reins over to Iraqis. And so the Bush administration was really desperate to find any kind of a storyline or some kind of a narrative that it could exploit to showcase its successes in Iraq. And so when we think about what the media coverage was doing in those 2 weeks in the summer of 2004, there was the sense that the Iraqi national team captured the American imagination. On the eve of their semifinal match, the LA Times called them the darlings of the summer games. news reports drew contrast between the brutal conditions that athletes had to endure competing under Saddam Hussein's son, Uday, who oversaw the national sports, and then on the other side, of course, the optimism that was offered by their recent liberation. Another piece showcased the new Iraq represented by a team that drew on athletes of different ethnic backgrounds, and I'll just read you a quote from a very nauseating piece of journalism from the Washington Post, which says, "They were just a bunch of kids from war-torn stadiums with guts and heart. They were Arab and Kurd from Fallujah and Najaf and Sadr City, carrying all the anxiety over events back home, the burning refuse and shot-up things that those city names conjure." And later, there was another book that romanticizes the experience that says, "Iraqi sports, it once meant death and destruction under Uday Hussein. Now it means life and a newfound freedom. It provides a link that brings down terrorism and helps in uniting a country in the name of democracy." And so again, just to show that this wasn't just the US media and writers who were kind of attempting to do this, the Bush administration itself sought to apply all of these kinds of narratives in its own re-election campaign. And so Bush, once these sort of victories start to be racked up, begins to cite them in his re-election stump speeches, and then in a national radio address following the team's opening match win over Portugal, he declares, "For the first time in decades, the world will see Iraqi Olympians free from the brutal punishment of a dictator's son. 29 athletes from Iraq are competing in Athens, including the Iraqi soccer team, which thrilled the world by winning its first game." And then later, when the team neared its semifinal, Bush's re-election campaign releases a TV ad, a very controversial TV ad that used the Iraqi team's success to justify the US invasion in dramatic fashion. Over images of the Olympic athletes competing with the flags of Iraq and Afghanistan in the background, a voiceover narration declares, "Freedom is spreading throughout the world like a sunrise. In this Olympics, there will be 2 more free nations and 2 fewer terrorist regimes. With strength, resolve, and courage, democracy will triumph over terror, and hope will defeat hatred." So this was the TV ad that Bush used as part of his re-election campaign. The Iraqi team would go on to lose its semifinal match and then settled for a 4th place finish in the Olympics, which caused the Bush administration to veer away from its appropriation of the team. But nevertheless, there was a lot of suggestions at the time that had the team actually reached the gold medal match, that Bush intended to actually fly to Athens himself to be in attendance. Now, this is usually an honor that's reserved for heads of state from the competing countries themselves. So it would have obviously sent a certain kind of signal to see sort of Bush there as a kind of a stand-in, as the sort of ruler of Iraq. And there was also a report that the Iraqi Olympic Committee was being asked to display the flag of Afghanistan alongside its own flag at the final match, which again, I think suggests this sort of neo-imperial kind of connections in the ways of sort of connecting Iraq and Afghanistan only by virtue of the fact that they both happen to be occupied by the United States military in that moment. So it's difficult to ascertain what impact that this campaign by Bush actually had on his re-election victory. But I think the fact that it happened less than 3 months before the election and that the PR campaign offered a certain glimmer of hope and optimism to an otherwise terrible condition that the Bush administration found itself in Iraq, having failed to stabilize conditions in Iraq, following this divisive war of choice, the U.S. believed that it needed to justify its initial intervention and continued military presence at a moment when the legitimacy of its mission was highly questioned. And so what this meant was, for the Bush administration, the success of these Iraqi athletes was held up as a validation of its decision to go to war. The war's defenders pointed to both symbolic and material benefits represented in the football team's success. So here we have, again, the same U.S. president who 4 years earlier, in the year 2000, ran on a platform of opposition to the idea of nation building. And now he was claiming victory in rebuilding the Iraqi nation. And whereas a lot of Middle East scholars at the time were cautioning that Iraq was far more on its way to becoming a failed state than a functional democracy, Bush's supporters advanced the narrative that this sign of or this positive sporting success on a global stage proved that democracy was actually taking root. Within Iraqi society, the U.S. narrative and its associated policies did not appear to have the desired effect. And so again, I think what's important here is to show that not only was the U.S. exploiting kind of football on this sort of global stage in kind of the biggest terms. But if we think about the way that the coalition was actually working, the coalition officials were working to showcase the occupation's support for the revival of football in Iraq. And so they had a number of other policies that one can point to when we look at the way that the occupation was actually operating. They would distribute footballs to children on religious holidays. They established thousands of amateur teams in sort of local cities and towns. They even lobbied the International Olympic Committee to readmit a post-Saddam Iraq following a lengthy suspension of its Olympic membership. But all of these goodwill gestures, I think anyone would agree, pale in comparison with the daily miseries endured by most Iraqis under military occupation. And so when we think about the fact that also the Olympics themselves were such a closely stage-managed experience, there was very little room for critique. And yet at the same time, I think it's interesting that in one very rare interview with some of the members of that Iraqi team, when they were asked how they felt about Bush using their success and using sort of their tournament as a means to sort of empower himself politically, many of them sort of spoke out, and they used that opportunity to actually criticize it. And so in one case, we have a midfielder, Saleh Sadr, who said Iraq as a team does not want Bush to use us for his presidential campaign. He should find another way to advertise himself. We don't wish for the American presence in our country. We want them to go away. Another player went even further, declaring that if he were not playing for the national team, he would have joined the resistance as a fighter to defend his homeland. And then even the team's coach, Adnan Hamid, who condemned the U.S. occupation, said that it had destroyed everything in the country. And then, of course, after this interview, you start to see that the team, from the coach to the players, were basically limited from having any media exposure after that, because there was a sense that they were clearly speaking out of turn from what the wishes of the sort of the U.S. colonial authorities or coalition authorities, I should say, were expecting from them at the time. And so just shifting gears a little bit to the next category, and this one is called In Search of Regime Legitimacy. And what I have here are two different examples that come to us from Egypt, and both of them are really kind of the attempts by which both of these different Egyptian regimes have attempted to also kind of employ football as a means of legitimizing themselves at a time of very deep unpopularity. And so the first example comes from late 2009, and this was at a time when Egypt was attempting to qualify for the World Cup. It hadn't made it since 1990, so it would have been a 20-year drought trying to qualify for the 2010 World Cup that was going to be held in South Africa. And it came down to one spot that would have gone to both, to either Egypt or Algeria. Both of them had sort of had a commanding lead over all of their other group matches, and so it really came down to a match between the two of them that was going to be held in Cairo. At that game, Egypt won 2-0, but this actually caused a tie, which required a sudden death match that was going to be held a few days later at a neutral location between both Algeria and Egypt, and that location ended up being in Sudan. And in that second match, Algeria won with a 1-0 victory, which shattered, of course, Egypt's hopes to end their World Cup drought. But overshadowing the football in this case, I think, was what really grabbed the headlines. Wasn't so much what was happening on the pitch, as opposed to the rise in tensions between the two different countries. And so, yes, there was just sort of simple disruptive behavior by fans, which we've seen before. But I think what's really crucial here is the way that this was encouraged and in many ways incited by the regimes. In this case, I'll focus mostly on the Egyptian side, although there's certainly a lot of research that can be done in terms of what was happening on the Algerian side as well, with another regime that was also kind of attempting to exploit this sort of conflict in sporting terms for political purposes. And so in Egypt, what we have on the one hand was the attack on the Algerian team bus, which caused injuries to some of their players and their team personnel. Then after the replay match in Sudan, there was a number of riots that broke out in Cairo as over 1,000 fans gathered at the Algerian embassy, where they burned Algerian flags in protest over reports that in Sudan, the Egyptian fans were being assaulted in the stadiums. And this caused, of course, the Egyptian officials to deploy their security personnel after the Algerian embassy was being firebombed. And then, of course, those subsequent clashes led to dozens of victories. The conflict eventually died down, but only after an escalation that included a very public war of words between the officials from the different countries. The Egyptians withdrew their ambassador from Algeria, and then there were even mutual economic reprisals that took place. And so again, I think what's really crucial here is to examine the role that the state actually had in sort of firing up the flames of jingoistic nationalism to serve its own ends. And here what we have, of course, is a very deeply unpopular regime led by Hosni Mubarak in Egypt at the time, which seized upon this moment of national unity by trying to mobilize Egyptians in opposition to this sort of constructed enemy. But I think more specifically here, not only was it looking to legitimize the Hosni Mubarak regime in particular, it was actually looking to advance the plans for Gamal Mubarak to succeed his aging father as president. And of course, this was very much an open secret in Egypt throughout the first decade of this century, in the early 2000s, was that Gamal Mubarak was being groomed to step in and take over as president of Egypt following his father's death. And so there were a number of questions about how this legitimation process was going to work. He didn't have a military background, which every previous Egyptian president had. He came from more of a business background. And then on top of that, of course, you have him sort of being handed over the keys to the state political party, but the party didn't really have very kind of deep roots within Egyptian society, so it was not really a very strong means of legitimizing himself. And so this sort of window of opportunity opened in 2009 when the Egyptian national team was on its way to possibly its first World Cup in 20 years. And so they tried to seize on what they saw as a kind of a history of a footballing rivalry with Algeria that goes all the way back to the 1950s, that goes back again to the 1990s. So there was a number of other kind of previous incidents between Egypt and Algeria that I won't get into here, but it's worth sort of knowing that there was a little bit of a context, because what happens is that it's not really the government that starts the kind of war of words, that a lot of this happens through fans and taunting, and a lot of it through cyber attacks and kind of the online sort of rivalries between Algerian fans and Egyptian fans. But what's really interesting is the way that this war of words leaves the sort of realm of online fan behavior or stadium behavior and really becomes something that's front and center within the Egyptian state media. And so we see this in a number of programs, radio shows, TV shows, newspaper headlines, all in the Egyptian state press, which means they all had the sort of tacit or explicit approval of the regime itself, in which you have these sort of outraged TV presenters saying, why do these Algerians hate us? And then just sort of airing over and over again videos of Algerian hooligan behavior. Other TV programs claimed that the Algerians were terrorizing Egyptians, subjecting them to a bloodbath. The state newspapers published all these unsubstantiated accusations saying that the Algerian government was emptying its prisons and sending thousands of criminals to wreak havoc on Egyptian fans in Sudan, attacking them with knives and daggers and heavy wooden sticks, according to one article. In other places, Algerians were described as uncivilized, as violent, as sick. And then even prominent celebrities, retired football stars, all of them kind of contributed to this mass hysteria. They all used their platforms to inflame the passions and rally around the Egyptian national team. But it was really the government figures themselves who I think are the focal point here. And we look specifically at Gamal Mubarak. Again, he has no military background, but I think they tried to use this sort of image of the Egyptian national team going in and sort of as if it was kind of a nation going to war. And if you actually look at a lot of the language that was being used, it had the language and imagery of war. We had these photographs of Gamal that were making the rounds, where he's sort of dressed in a suit and draped in an Egypt scarf, cheering on his team from the stands, where he's sort of like a general leading his army into battle. He struck an ominous tone in his TV interview where he said, Egypt is a major power that should not be taken lightly. Gamal's older brother Ala was even more brazen in his words, leading to a New York Times report to remark that he sounded as if he were calling his nation to war. And then calling into a popular program that justified the emotional reactions to the events in Sudan, saying we have to take a stand. Enough is enough. Egypt should be respected. We're Egyptian, we hold our head high, and whoever insults us should be smacked on his head. Elsewhere, he continued to escalate the verbal attack on Egypt's nemesis, proclaiming there's nothing called Arab nationalism or brotherhood. When they learn to speak Arabic, they can come say they're Arabs. Here he is, of course, talking about Algerians. And then, of course, not to be outdone, Hosni Mubarak himself delivered a speech to a joint session of parliament after Egypt's defeat, saying Egypt does not tolerate those who hurt the dignity of its sons. Egypt, of course, withdrew its ambassador from Algeria and threatened to boycott international football for the next 2 years if FIFA did not take action against Algeria. And again, in the short term, I think the Mubarak regime's ability to rally support for itself clearly proved effective. Its allies within the media, popular culture, and the broader society mobilized heavily to support the national team. They offered little opposition to the emergence of Imam Mubarak as the face of Egypt's short-lived quote-unquote war. As one Egyptian fan was quoted as saying at the time, he said, "I didn't fight in 1973, but I'll be there in 2009. But I think it's clear that ultimately these efforts likely backfired, because Egypt's failures on the pitch and the upheaval that followed paved the way for a broader discussion regarding the government's failure to provide adequate education, employment, and housing. And meanwhile, of course, the violent crackdown on rioting fans by security forces served as a reminder of the regime's willingness to use violence as a means of maintaining public order. And so I think one of the things we can see, for instance, by the very end, is the fact that in a lot of ways, when regimes attempt to use this, it ultimately backfires, but because it simply raises a question onto the shortcomings of the regimes themselves. So Western outlets, for example, that covered these events identified deep-seated frustrations among the Egyptians they interviewed. And so this was, I think, a sign of things to come. We think this is happening in 2009. By early 2011, of course, we have the popular mobilization that results in that kind of revolutionary moment that Egyptians would come to have in what comes to be known as the Arab Spring. But here's a quote from 2009 in which one Egyptian quoted in the New York Times says, you know, if we're infuriated, it's not over soccer. To hell with the game. We're infuriated over our dignity. And just switching gears a little bit now to the next case study here, again, in search of legitimacy, here we fast forward to 2017 when Egypt finally realizes its dreams of returning to the World Cup. So this time, thankfully, the Egyptian team has Mohamed Salah, who converts this dramatic stoppage time penalty to give Egypt a 2-1 victory over Congo. And this time, Egypt makes it to the World Cup, the first time in nearly 30 years. But again, Egypt at this time, the context was very different. We have a short-lived democratic transition that was upended by military coup. The July 2013 intervention that brings Sisi to power was accompanied by a wave of violent repression that aimed to throttle the revolutionary hopes of millions of Egyptians. And so here we have things like the Ramadan massacre, in which security forces killed over 1,000 protesters at one sit-in. We have tens of thousands of more Egyptians that are imprisoned on political charges. Hundreds of them were sentenced to death in these mass trials that abandoned all pretense of judicial procedure. And then, of course, we have all of these new anti-terrorism laws that do things like govern public gatherings, that deny humanitarian advocacy, media reporting, and journalism, so that there is a kind of attempt to destroy civil society in almost every meaningful way to participation in political life. Even football wasn't spared by the Sisi regime in those early years. Club ultras, many of which had been politicized during the revolution, were outlawed. They were declared to be terrorists. There was a ban on match attendance by fans, which followed the clash with security forces in Boursaid in 2012 that left 74 fans dead. That ban remained in effect through 2018. Even someone like Mohamed Abu Trika, who was a kind of a legend in Egyptian football history, and who'd led his nation to a number, I think to 2 African Cup titles, was added to the list of terrorists in Egypt for having expressed his support for the government of Mohamed Morsi during the transition. His assets were frozen, and then, of course, state media led a barrage of attacks against his character. So this is kind of the backdrop in which, in the lead up to the World Cup, Sisi is attempting very desperately to co-opt the Egyptian national team's appearance on the biggest stage to legitimize his rule, which had yet to really kind of be firmly rooted. And so in the months before the World Cup, the Egyptian Football Association held a president led by its president, Hani Abu Rida, where they offered their endorsement for Sisi's re-election. Of course, there wasn't a meaningful election in Egypt at this time. It was still very much, a kind of a sham election with a foregone conclusion. The regime had arrested all of the challengers to Sisi at that time, but Sisi was still very happy to accept the endorsement and the fawning praise, not just from the head of the Egyptian Football Association, but the presidents of all of the most important clubs in the country. They all kind of stood behind a banner that read, "The Egyptian Football Association backs and supports President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to lead the country through continuous achievements," and they all kind of issued their fawning praise. FIFA announced that it was considering possible sanctions because there's a very direct violation there of its policy against football associations taking explicitly partisan political stances. But of course, FIFA never ends up taking any action, and the EFA continues to sort of use its platform as a means of bolstering its support for Sisi. And then, of course, there was the World Cup itself, and the way that the EFA was attempting to try to exploit not just the team's victory, but specifically the success of Mohamed Salah. Of course, this was at the point where he becomes a global superstar, having just won the Premier League Player of the Year after his first season with Liverpool. Now he was poised to lead the national team to success in Russia, for which, of course, the regime was expecting to have full credit. The problem was that the EFA was overly exploitative in its behavior toward its star player. So we see things like, for instance, when they violate his image rights by trying to put Salah's face on the side of an Egyptian aircraft. His agent filed a number of complaints that became very public, detailing a number of lawsuits, and that he basically said that there was a kind of a back and forth between them on the exploitation of Salah's image by Telecom Egypt, by Egypt Airlines, and in a rare moment of public criticism, even Salah himself issued a statement calling his treatment extremely insulting. And then there was reports later on, during and after the World Cup, in which Salah was also reportedly frustrated by the poor management of the team. And so we see this, of course, in the results. Egypt ends up kind of crashing out quite abysmally in the World Cup, and we get a sense, based on the fact that the EFA chose Chechnya to be the base for the team's camp in Russia during the World Cup, where the Egyptian team was being paraded around by the leader of Russia, Ramzan Kadyrov. And we see Salah getting honorary Chechen citizenship. We also see that the Egyptian Football Association was basically selling these high-value tickets to a number of Egyptian businessmen and celebrities to come to the team hotel and to sort of mingle with the team, all of which, of course, affected the team's ability to prepare. And so in the aftermath of the final humiliating match, which was against Saudi Arabia, of all teams, in which Egypt once again lost, Salah reportedly considered retirement from international duties. He later expressed publicly his dismay at the EFA's lack of protection for its players and the many disturbances, those are his words, to which they were subjected in their exploitation through these excessive public appearances. So in the end, the Egyptian regime's overzealous attempts to exploit football and success proved to be a spectacular failure. And again, a lot of this, I think, stems from the inability of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to really find other means by which to legitimize himself. So he didn't really follow the kind of authoritarian playbook. There was no attempts to establish a mass political party to sort of channel support from within the population. There weren't attempts to try to win over kind of some of the major elites within society that existed outside of the military. And then, of course, you have the military's increased role both in economic terms, but also in terms of the political governance of the country, its control over the security establishment and structures in the country. And all of this points to a very desperate attempt to sort of cynically exploit football as a means to try to kind of paper over a number of the other cracks that existed within his ability to legitimize himself. And again, there's a lot of other kind of details in terms of the role of the Egyptian's general intelligence services that has sort of ownership of a media group that owns the Egyptian, the sponsorship rights for the Egyptian Football Association, and the way that they attempted to kind of exploit this. But I'll move right along to the next category, which is this category of warding off political threats. And this one kind of takes us a little bit more to looking at kind of the role that Gulf states have played. And so this one kind of specifically comes from the summer of 2017, at a time when the French club PSG made kind of international headlines by shelling out a massive transfer fee to Barcelona to bring Brazilian star Neymar to the forward line of this French team. This was more than double the previous record fee. So if the fee that they paid was 220 million euros, the previous record was something like 105. And not content with that, they also added the second player, Kylian Mbappe from Monaco, on a loan deal that becomes 180 million euro transfer a year later. And so this was seen on the one hand as being part of a typical arms race that happens in European football, that this is just, all of this sort of international money coming in and sort of changing the game, so to speak. But I think we have to kind of look beyond just the sort of typical football arms race among Europe's elite, and think about it more in terms of the geopolitical developments that were happening at the time. So when we think specifically about what happens in early June in 2017, when the governments of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt cut off relations with Qatar, accuse it of supporting terrorism and interfering in their affairs. And as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that this blockade was not going to go away anytime soon, that it represented the deepest crisis in the history of the GCC. And in response, of course, Qatar takes a number of measures, things that we all know. They strengthen their relations with regional powers like Turkey and Iran. They appeal to the US administration at the time to try to bring its influence to bear. They start to develop their own domestic industries. They go into their cash reserves to try to stabilize their economy. So all of this stuff that's been covered elsewhere. But I think when we think about the historical rivalry between Qatar and its neighbors, chiefly, of course, Saudi Arabia, and its attempt to sort of exercise hegemony over its neighbors, that this was really part of what has long been billed as a kind of a soft power strategy to try to kind of develop its infrastructure, establishing global media news networks, establishing institutions of higher learning and education, and of course its investment in culture, both in terms of museums as well as sports. And so winning the World Cup was the biggest achievement that Qatar had made up to that point by 2010. But it also then embarked on a number of other sporting investments. Of course, the 2011 purchase of PSG was a major part of that. 2 years later, of course, Qatar Airways also reaches an agreement with Barcelona to become its first ever sponsor. So all of these developments, they point to kind of basic soft power tactics. But when we think about the events of 2017 in particular, I think it's very clear that this goes beyond sort of specific soft power tactics to think about ways that this was really about warding off the threats. Because in this case, not only did the blockading countries, of course, enact their blockade, but that they had also mobilized all of their diplomatic and economic might to wage an aggressive media campaign to isolate Qatar, diminish its reputation globally, accusing it of supporting terrorism. Those accusations would go hand in hand with questions surrounding Qatar's ability to host a successful World Cup. And then, of course, adding to those rising tensions, the US president seemed at the time to lend his endorsement to the blockade, accusing Qatar of funding radical ideology following this high-profile visit he made to Saudi Arabia. And so again, we've seen the sort of spectrum of different Qatari responses, but I think the Neymar deal specifically should be viewed in that same light, that the exorbitant cost defied the recent fiscal conservatism prior to the blockade that had led to budget cuts across all sectors, including those involved in the World Cup preparations. And the structure of the deal also ensured that Neymar's commitment wasn't only to PSG, but that it was to Qatar's overarching goals. So QSI, the agency, of course, that owns PSG and which paid the transfer fee, paid a total of 300 million euros, in excess of 78 million over the buyout clause. And in that time, Neymar signed a 5-year agreement with PSG, which would take him through 2022. Of course, that was the year of the Qatar World Cup, and he agreed to act as a spokesman for the World Cup that was taking place. So again, this was an attempt to try to bring him in as a kind of spokesperson, not just for the club, but really for the country as well. And this was meant to be kind of a symbol of its defiance against this attempted isolation. Shifting now to the next category, and here I talk a little bit about securitization strategies. And so on this side, On the other side, rather, of the GCC crisis, we see that the UAE was also thinking of ways of employing its footballing interests in pursuit of its concrete political objectives. So rather than just warding off threats, which is the sort of the category in which Qatar exists, I think the Emirati government in this case was attempting to leverage its stake in one of the most powerful football clubs in Europe to support its regional securitization policies. And so this really has more to do with the Emirati response to the Arab uprisings that aim to dismantle the ruling order in much of the region. Of course, the UAE positioned itself at the very head of this counter-revolutionary force, committed to maintaining the authoritarian character that defined most states in the region. Led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, the UAE played a very critical role in a number of different events. We see, of course, in the coup in Egypt that brought Sisi to power. It backed the leader of the military warlord Khalifa Haftar in Libya, and a key player, of course, it became in the destructive civil war in Yemen. It's also been accused of attempting to derail Tunisians' transition to democratic rule. So really, one would be hard-pressed to find any quarter of the Arab region that hasn't been impacted by aggressive Emirati diplomatic, economic, and military intervention during the last decade. As the New York Times wrote of MBZ, he seems to believe that the Middle East's only choices are a more repressive order or total catastrophe. And so I think this very nicely encapsulates sort of what the binary is as viewed from the position of the Emirati government. And then in 2015, The Guardian reported that the Emirati government had threatened to block arms purchases and energy deals worth billions of pounds if the UK government did not take decisive action against the Muslim Brotherhood. So again, thinking in terms of its attempt to sort of repress political dissent and sort of democratic transitions across the region, the Muslim Brotherhood was sort of singled out as being kind of a force that was seen more in that column. And so as a result, not only do governments like Saudi Arabia and the UAE ban it domestically, but they really attempt to have more of a regional-based policy, both in pursuing a crackdown in places like Egypt and Tunisia of one of these prominent actors within society in the Arab region. But then even taking it further. And I think here maybe they're employing the lessons from the 1950s when there were similar kind of crackdowns in places like Egypt, and there was an attempt to suggest that, well, because these organizations can find haven elsewhere, that this time there has to be an attempt to try and root it out more globally. And so we see, for instance, the kind of pressure that is brought to bear on the British government in particular at this time. And so in a number of documents that were obtained by The Guardian, there's a number of instances where Emirati officials were communicating to their British counterparts that they needed to take very explicitly aggressive measures in denying the Muslim Brotherhood a safe haven there. So we see this relayed in part through Abu Dhabi's ownership of Manchester City's footballing club. And there's a number of examples here. In 2012, a member of the Manchester City Board of Directors, Simon Pearce, put forward a series of economic incentives for British companies and the British military in exchange for taking these decisive measures. These included things like purging the BBC of Islamist infiltration, a crackdown against prominent figures and organizations in the British Muslim community, and issuing kind of laws and things to kind of ban the organization. And so in exchange, the government of David Cameron at the time was promised energy contracts with BP, an order of military hardware worth £6 billion, and enhancement of the two militaries' military and intelligence cooperation. 2 years later, when no decisive action was taken, Khaldoon al-Mubarak, Manchester City's chairman and the close confidant of MBZ, delivered a warning to the British ambassador to the UAE that inaction against the Brotherhood had raised a red flag due to the fact that our ally is not seeing it as we do, an existential threat, not just to the UAE, but to the region. And this is a quote. So the British government then responded in part by trying to conduct a lengthy inquiry into the activities of the Brotherhood in Britain. Its final reports offered some critiques of the movement, but was ultimately inconclusive and apparently not to the liking of Emirati officials who continued to withhold the government's financial incentives. And so just quickly on the question of Abu Dhabi's 2008 takeover of Manchester City. This was initially viewed as a project in Emirati state branding that featured both a sporting and an urban transformation for the city of Manchester. The club was renamed, the club stadium was renamed for Abu Dhabi's flagship airline, Etihad, and Emirati officials later pledged to invest £1 billion to redevelop the city's infrastructure and construct thousands of new homes. In 2013, Human Rights Watch issued a report revealing Emirati human rights abuses and condemned these efforts to use Manchester City to construct a public relations image of a progressive, dynamic Gulf state, which deflects attention from what is really going on in the country. And that's a quote from that Human Rights Watch report. But again, I think what's clear from this example that I give is that this wasn't simply a matter of kind of sports washing or an attempt to sort of improve the UAE's image. I think what we see in the Emirati investment in Manchester City extends far beyond simple sort of enhancing of a country's reputation. What we see here, I think, was that the club's personnel was actually enlisted in the attacks both on Qatar, on the attempts to try as much as possible to exert pressure on the British government, and using their economic leverage as a means of pressure to elicit specific policy responses. And we see this in particular with this 2016 report that Pierce, again from the board of Manchester City, that he helped facilitate the hiring of a very kind of shady consulting firm in the UK that was basically hired to plant negative stories about Qatar in the British press. One newspaper that was subjected to the secret lobbying published 34 articles over a 2-month period accusing Qatar of supporting terrorism. And then there was this 2017 study by a little-known consulting firm called Cornerstone Global Associates, which issues this report that gets widely publicized that calls into question Qatar's ability to host the 2022 World Cup, concluding that it has to either be stripped of its hosting duties or forced to share with its neighbors. And of course, later investigations and media leaks would reveal that Cornerstone was likely acting at the behest of the UAE government. And so, just to sort of top off this category, the World Cup served as an underlying factor in the GCC crisis, with the Emirati foreign minister at one point suggesting that Qatar's hosting responsibilities should be directly linked to its meeting the demands of the blockading states. And Dubai's security chief put it more bluntly, writing that if the World Cup goes out of Qatar, the crisis in Qatar will end because the crisis was made to break it. And I think that really kind of captures quite well sort of where the position was coming from. And I'll just conclude with one final example, and this is really the category of sports washing. And this is the one that I imagine most people are familiar with. So I'll just say that I think, this one has a very deep history. We think back maybe to the 1978 World Cup that was infamously played in Argentina at a time when the ruling military junta there was disappearing thousands of Argentine citizens in concentration camps and summary executions. And so that really stands out as, I think, one of the starkest examples of an attempt by a regime to sort of whitewash its crimes by hosting or participating or kind of investing in some kind of a global sporting event. And I think what we see is that Saudi Arabia recently has been attempting to kind of aggressively ramp up its links and investments in both global football as well as kind of domestic football as a means to try to kind of cover up some of its more recent hits to its reputation. We see this from them hosting both the Spanish Super Cup as well as the Italian Super Cup. We see it through these multi-year marketing licensing agreements with the Spanish League. There was also a push to try to send a number of Saudi players to play in Spain. Normally, in a loan agreement like this, we don't necessarily see the host country or league paying the expenses to this degree, but all of these were sort of prepaid for Saudi players that ended up in the Spanish League. None of them, I think, except maybe for one, ever saw any playing time. But the idea was to try to kind of establish this financial relationship that was very lucrative as a means of sort of slowly bringing in Saudi Arabia into European football. Then, of course, there was the 40 million euro deal to host the Spanish Super Cup over 3 years, beginning, of course, in this last year in 2019. So I think a lot of this, of course, reflects much on the changes underway in Saudi Arabia since the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I'm not going to get into the details. You can read about that, I'm sure, in many different places, but suffice it to say that he invested many, many millions in trying to sort of enhance his reputation, and all of that was sort of washed away through the campaign of dissent, the sort of very embarrassing reports of sort of the different behavior of the prince, both in terms of how he was treating the the sort of economic and royal elites within Saudi Arabia, the cracking down on dissent by activists and sort of the imprisonment and torture, the war in Yemen, of course, which unleashed the cholera epidemic, put 12 million people at risk of starvation, all of those kinds of things. And then, of course, topping it all off with the Khashoggi assassination in Istanbul in October of 2018. And so I think when we link some of the more recent behavior in terms of Saudi Arabia trying to invest, obviously they do it with a number of concert performances, professional wrestling exhibitions, tennis matches, but the idea of having people like Leo Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo competing for actual silverware on Saudi soil, I think was meant to offer a major boost to the country's big image problems. And again, I think we see that it's worked in the sense, it's been effective in the sense that there's been a number of very highly lucrative agreements. Clearly, a number of these leagues and a number of these kind of corporate sponsorship agreements haven't really been affected by these major human rights abuses and the sort of isolation that MBS experienced, specifically in those early months right after the Khashoggi killing. When we think about the fact that his Davos in the desert was widely boycotted, when he would appear at international meetings and people would be afraid to have world leaders would be afraid to have their pictures taken with him. That I think that this is really part of the attempt to try, of course, to legitimize himself yet again. And so just for time purposes, I'll just sort of leave it there, and I'll take your questions. So thank you very much for listening, and congratulations if you've made it this far.
I appreciate and I thank you so much, Dr. Alarian. You actually gave a new perspective and angle to the football lovers. The way you encapsulated the football diplomacy and the football as an apparatus of nationalism and for the regime legitimation, it was really interesting and enlightening. So yeah, we have a lot of questions, and I would like you to answer some of them according to our time restraints. So there is a question that how to increase the non-national players on national teams' effect to the political soft power of sports such as football.
Sorry, can you repeat that one? I had a hard time hearing it.
So the question is that how do the increase in non-national players on national teams affect the football soft power of sports such as football?
Non-national players. I'm assuming this refers to the nationalization of foreign players by different national teams. I think this is a practice that's been in effect for a very long time. Obviously, we see it more heavily critiqued in the case of Gulf states that have relied much more heavily on, again, though some people would say foreign talent versus homegrown talent, but I think, again, that all of the international footballing organizations tend to have very specific guidelines and restrictions. So for instance, when we think about the Qatari team's success at the last Asian Cup, there were criticisms, especially I think the UAE lodged a complaint that some of its players were not homegrown. But in those cases, I think there's always kind of a sense that there's a there's a certain kind of procedure to follow. So either they have parents from there, they were raised there from a very young age. So there's a number of kind of different approaches to how countries use that, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that ultimately they're there to simply represent their current home country, and how that affects, I think, national identity is a really interesting question. In fact, there is one researcher who's part of this bigger project that I'm working with, who's looking at that question, and so I would definitely encourage you maybe to look at that work once it's made available. But the only thing I would add is I think clearly states take very concrete measures to try and sort of paint their national teams with the sort of flag of the nation, as opposed to kind of celebrating their multiple national identities. So we haven't really seen much space for that, especially players coming from a number of other kind of countries' backgrounds. And of course, there's a lot more about this from the European standpoint when we consider the success of the German and French national teams, for example, in the last decade or so, that was reliant so heavily on players that come from kind of foreign backgrounds.
Thank you so much. So there is another question that can we equate the hosting of FIFA 2020 and hosting of US forces by Gulf states in the term of regime legitimation?
Um, can we equate them? I mean, they're certainly not related because what's interesting, of course, is the United States was competing directly with Qatar for the hosting of 2022, and they were very unhappy. And the U.S. has been quite aggressive in trying to kind of, if not outright strip Qatar of its hosting duties, to at least to expose any kind of accusations of bribery or malfeasance of some kind in terms of the way that that bid actually happened. And so I wouldn't say that there's a direct correlation between the two, but certainly both of them play some certain roles, right? That they're both part of this attempt to ward off threats to try to maintain positive relations with certain members of the international community that's meant to kind of sustain it against any sort of threats from its neighbors, specifically in this case I would say Saudi Arabia and then maybe also the UAE. Sorry, I think are you muted? Because I can't hear you anymore.
Okay, so there is another question which says that what is your take on ambiguous publication on Zionist rules in early 20th century and ignite the football business as a to distract nations?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been one of the arguments that's made. I think quite often it goes a bit far because I think it's sort of to consign a lot of these kind of cultural forms and expressions as simple distractions, I think really devalues from a lot of other positive values that they generate in society that we can kind of go into. But I think certainly a lot of regimes would hope to do that. I think we see that a lot of authoritarian states certainly would hope to find certain kind of cultural outlets for their populations. But as I argued, I think specifically in the kind of Egypt example, that all of these attempts ultimately backfire because there's only so much you can do to mask over so many of your shortcomings as a state, to not provide for your citizens, to repress people from being able to express themselves politically, as a means of sort of simply using sports to mask that, I think has never really proven effective, especially not in the long term. Maybe sometimes there are short-term gains for states. But I think the other thing we can think about actually is quite the opposite, that these oftentimes end up being means by which populations find space to mobilize, because it's safer to mobilize under the auspices of sports, and you end up sort of with societies that are a little bit more organized on the basis of their experience mobilizing in this capacity. Of course, football ultras are always used as the example, but they're certainly not the only ones. We see it even in terms of fan culture around national teams. We see it in a number of other ways, especially when we think about sports less at the sort of formal elite sports level and more at the local level, when it comes to kind of local clubs and amateur leagues and things along those lines, that all of those still exist as spaces by which citizens are able to kind of actually express themselves and to organize and kind of become kind of collectives that ultimately can be channeled in political modes in the long term.
So there is another question which says that whilst also, is there anything unique but which makes it malleable with the political use, and how can sports like cricket and American football function similarly and differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we find a lot of parallels across different sports, certainly, both in terms of the way that regimes exploit it, but also in terms of the way that fan culture develops, also in terms of the way that it kind of creates a way around which people can rally and mobilize. And I think, we've seen it certainly in American football in the United States, although I will say that I think given its sort of mass corporatization, that over time it's become less of a place for that level of mobilization and more of a place actually to sort of maintain a certain kind of complacent citizenry, specifically when we think, I would say really since 2001, the way in which formal American sports have been kind of employed as a means of kind of, as an extension of state authority too. And I think there's been a lot of research done on that. But I think, all of these sports function differently. Clearly football stands apart as a global phenomenon, as one that has kind of been democratized over the decades. Again, I think that's why I liked starting off with the example coming from Africa, because I think that this was really a turning point by the late 1950s in which this sport that was long seen as the elite domain of European states and perhaps some Latin American states, all of a sudden there was a sense that the terrain was shifting, that it was beginning to include more countries, that it was including more parts of the world that have been long neglected and left behind.
So there is another question, and someone is interested to know about the examples where the football has been used against the regime legitimation, and how can citizens use the political potential of football for their favor?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many examples of that, and so I definitely don't want to give the impression by this presentation and from this paper that this is something that has been a one-sided relationship. I just wanted to focus on a side that I thought was very unique and interesting and hasn't really been studied to this degree. But I think there's so much literature out there on the way in which football becomes a source of empowerment for populations. Again, we see it with the studies of ultras in various places. Egypt, of course, there's been a number of different really valuable studies. There's actually a researcher that's part of this particular project who's looking at the role of footballing fans in Algeria during just the last couple of years, looking at the Algerian Revolution and the ways that football fans, and specifically the sort of the slogans, the artwork, the chanting, the songs have all been kind of employed in a way that actually has become overtly politicized in its criticism of the regime in Algeria. And I think, again, there's so many examples of that one can find from Latin America, from Europe. When we look at the history of specific clubs, that certain clubs have always mobilized around opposition to state repression, for example, or authoritarian tendencies, and that fans have often found ways to organize around on that basis, because this is a kind of structure that's already pre-built in a way that is more conducive than trying to kind of form a spontaneous movement, which of course happens as well. But it's interesting to see the ways that different forces within society can actually employ pre-existing structures and networks and organizations and movements and use them in a way that ultimately ends up taking on this sort of political character.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah Al-Aryan. It was really enlightening, and thank you so much for sparing time for CIGA. We wish you best of luck for your project, and on the behalf of whole team, I'm again thanking you a lot. So before ending, I would like to announce, ladies and gentlemen, that tomorrow we have our 12th session, which is about on confronting tyranny in Islam by Dr. Usama Al-Azmi from the University of Oxford, UK. I request you to join, and you can also join our YouTube page of CIGA, and where you can find all of these lectures recorded in the YouTube link. With this, I will end the session. I thank you everybody who joined us and who participated, and all of those who will watch our lecture later on the YouTube. Thank you so much.